Mounting international condemnation against the brutal crackdown by Myanmar's military junta, the United Nations Security Council issued a presidential statement. The UNSC reiterated deep concern about the development in Myanmar while condemning the violence against peaceful protesters. UNSC called for immediate release of those detained arbitrarily. But the UNSC statement removed the reference to a coup as suggested by India, Russia, China and Vietnam. The threat to consider a further action was also removed from the UNSC statement, and the statement also mentioned India's constructive engagement on the issue. India has expressed concerns over the crackdown on the peaceful demonstrations and has sought restoration of democratic order in Myanmar. India has also sought the release of political detainees. India and Myanmar share a 1,643-kilometer-long border. According to a senior Indian official, around 100 people have crossed over a porous border into India since the protests began. Now, most of them are policemen with their families, and several have taken shelter in Mizoram. Authorities in Myanmar had asked Mizoram to detain and return the 8 police officers. Meanwhile, a decision on repatriations is pending with India's federal government. For more on this, we're being joined by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal. Good evening to you, Siddhant. Now, the UNSC statement has mentioned India's constructive engagement on this issue. Let's start there. Take us through the details on this.
Well, Alison, Myanmar has been a global issue, and we know that India has been talking about it not only at multilateral forums but also during its bilateral conversations, the latest being the virtual summit with the Swedish Prime Minister, but talking specifically about what is happening at the United Nations Security Council, where India is a non-permanent member at the high table for a 2-year term. We know that India has played a constructive role. There have been 2 statements coming from United Nations Security Council, one on February 4th and secondly on the 10th of March, that is yesterday. Starting with the February statement, we know that India not only played an active role, an important role, but acted as a bridge in making sure that the statement comes out, which is a statement which is a balanced statement. In this, the second conversation which happened just yesterday, India played as usual, continued playing its role as a constructive role. But if we talk about when it comes to other talks, like there have been conversations about sanctions as well, this is something that India would not, of course, stand for. We know that officially India is against such kind of sanctions, but largely if we look at India's stance at the United Nations on Myanmar, India made only one public statement. This public statement was made by India's envoy to the United Nations in February month, towards the end of February. And it talked about 3 points. First, about restoration of democratic order. Secondly, about the release of political detainees. And thirdly, about the repatriation of Rohingyas. This is something that was a considerable part of that statement. And this is something that India has repeated many times in number of private conversations at the high table at the United Nations Security Council. But this is not the last of what we have seen at the UNSC. We know China is something which has been playing as perhaps not very positive role. In fact, yesterday when the statement, the presidential statement of the United Nations Security Council came out, 2 countries, 2 permanent veto holding members of the UNSC, US and China, came out with a statement. The US statement was largely lauding that there is, of course, movement at the high table. But the Chinese statement was something that raised eyebrows, because by and large it parroted what the military in Myanmar has been saying. Also, it did not mention about the restoration of democracy or about the entire situation, or perhaps something that India has talked about, which is, of course, the Rohingyas as well. So largely it talked about that how the international community should play a constructive role in making sure all sides sit on the table. But the big question is, the half the side, which of course has been talked about by China in the statement, is in jail. So who China is referring to have this kind of conversation? But pretty pretty complex conversations that are expected to continue. These are larger geopolitical games as well, because China, of course, is someone who is seen close to the military in Myanmar. Of course, India also has a close relationship with the Myanmarese military. In fact, last year India gave a submarine as well to Myanmar. But clearly now the big focus is on the Quad meeting that will take place tomorrow, and that Quad meeting is expected to talk about the situation in Myanmar.
Right, and Siddhant, you've spoken about some of the very important things that are mentioned in this statement. Now, it's also important to notice what was left out. What can we understand by the UNSC statement removing the reference to a coup, as was suggested by India, Russia, China and Vietnam, and also the threat to consider further action to be taken, this being removed from the statement?
Well, the reference to coup has been missing in the UNSC statement, and it is largely because of countries like China and Russia who are not very keen to put the term coup, and of course a direct criticism of the military, the Myanmar military as well. This is the UNSC dynamics, which is clearly playing out with countries trying to make sure the wrath of the West is not in a sense in a full blow on Myanmar. And that is why this kind of dynamics will continue. But if, as you mentioned about China, India hasn't sided with the Chinese or the Russians when it comes to the entire development in the United Nations Security Council, particularly when it comes to condemnation. In fact, there has been reference to condemnation in the statement of the United Nations Security Council, the presidential statement. And this is for the first time that UNSC has condemned what has been happening when it comes to the peaceful protesters in Myanmar. So largely, if we put or perhaps bracket India with China or Russia when it comes to the UNSC dynamics on Myanmar, that of course will be wrong, because India has played its own role, a much more constructive role, and making sure that there is a balance in the approach when it comes to the West and China and Russia, because of course the West is keen that there is complete sanctions perhaps on Myanmar, but Russia and China are also keen that there is no criticism as well, much criticism on Myanmar. So India has been able to bridge both sides, the sides which has been espoused by China and Russia, and of course the stance which has been espoused by the West.
Siddhant, thank you very much for bringing us all those details.